Welcome, everyone. I'm Arielle Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad that you are all here with us. Just a quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural and culinary heritage, history and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate, and I'll put that in the chat too. So just a little bit of Zoom protocol. Lena and I from Village Preservation are here. We won't be visible during the talk, but we will be in the chat, so please feel free to say hello, tell us where you're joining from, and to raise any issues or thoughts. If you have questions for our speakers, we do ask that you please use the Q&A function. It just helps us to keep track a little bit better. You can do that at any point in the talk, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I am very, very pleased to introduce tonight's panel. Irene Sax is a journalist and food writer. Irene co-wrote Beard on Pasta and helped Beard prepare countless magazine articles and other publications. She became the food editor of New York Newsday, which closed in 1995, and now teaches food writing at New York University while maintaining an active career as a freelance food writer and occasional restaurant critic. Irene is a 2000 James Beard Award winner in internet writing.
That's right.
That's right. John Birdsall is the author of The Man Who Ate Too Much, The Life of James Beard, the definitive biography of America's best known and least understood food personality. We will try to achieve higher understanding this evening. And the modern culinary landscape he shaped. Birdsall spent 17 years in professional kitchens and wrote for the San Francisco Sentinel, a pioneering LGBTQ weekly. After leaving the kitchen, he was a restaurant critic and features writer and editor of San Francisco Weekly's food blog. In 2014, he won a James Beard Award for food and culture writing for America, Your Food is So Gay in Lucky Peach, and another in 2016 for Straight Up Passing in the queer food journal Jarry. He's written for Food and Wine, Bon Appetit, and the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Los Angeles Times, and taught culinary writing at the San Francisco Cooking School. I really had to compress a lot of these bios, and they're still just so impressive. Okay, Mitchell Davis is a cookbook author, food journalist, and scholar with a PhD in food studies from New York University. Davis was the chief strategy officer of the James Beard Foundation for nearly 3 decades, during which he created and oversaw many of the organization's most important initiatives, including leading the James Beard team that created the USA Pavilion at Expo Milano in 2015. In addition to his work at the foundation, Davis writes about and reviews restaurants. He also holds a chair on the Academy of the London-based World's 50 Best Restaurants ranking program. He has written 4 cookbooks, including The Mensch Chef and Kitchen Sense. Davis's television appearances include the History Channel's 101 Fast Foods That Changed the World, Food Network's Foodography, Throwdown with Bobby Flay, and Best in Smoke. Love that. Davis was host of Taste Matters, a weekly radio show on the Heritage Radio Network until 2015. In 2013, The Forward selected Davis as one of the 50 most influential Jews under 50 in America. So these 3 amazing panelists will be moderated by the also amazing Annie Hauk. Annie is the co-author of Gastropolis, Food and New York City. She is also the president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society. She's a registered dietitian, an associate professor of foods and nutrition at Brooklyn College, and a creator and master composter of Brooklyn Mompost, a composting service dedicated to teaching composting and green living at events all over the city. Woo! All right, Annie, I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you all so much for being here. Take us away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ariel. I'm no longer the president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society, but I'm knee deep in compost. So hope that counts. Okay, so this is wonderful to be gathered with all of you to talk about James Beard. And before we get into the meat of James Beard, let's talk about getting a sense of the food world when James Beard was a household name. In the 70s and 80s, he was at the pinnacle of his fame. I know for me, it was just using the book Beard on Bread religiously like it was a Bible because it worked so well. So what was going on in the food world of the 70s and 80s, friends?
I can talk to that because I was there and I kind of beginning. My first connection with James Beard was as Beard Wolf, 3 people who were presumably Cook's catalog in 1978. And his name was part of, he didn't have anything to do with it, but he was such a big name that having him on the masthead was important. I have a feeling that up until then, maybe I'm wrong, people weren't talking about food that much. But I mean, they would talk about, have you had dinner? But food was not a topic of conversation, and food people weren't celebrities. I think that began in the 70s, actually.
I think in scholarship, food scholars had to find one another in the 80s. Mitchell, when you got your PhD, your program at NYU was solid and an example for other programs around the country. I was a few years before you when we really had to find one another and start to cobble together studies in food. So the culinary historians, for example, and professors at NYU and at other universities became kindred spirits and started to amass energy into something more formal. And then it became mainstream.
Sure. I mean, I can speak from the perspective of sort of spending a lot of time in the archives of the Beard Foundation, if you will, and also hearing, you know, it's not like there wasn't great food before the 70s. And in fact, we were just talking with Irene, the book that she wrote with Beard on Pasta in 1983, when she went back to review it, had all this amazing international food in it. But I think it was much more concentrated. The media, people could not share the experience, you know, believe it or not, it was before social media. And so if you were interested, as you say, Annie, whether it was in scholarship or in cooking or in sort of the competitive Beard and Julia Child battles of dinner that took place that many people have written about, you had to work to find like-minded, like-palated folks. And you couldn't, I mean, we all, well, those of us old enough to remember the grocery store, you couldn't find the things you might want, and there was no mail order, Amazon, anything. So, I mean, I say that half facetiously, but but the idea, like, it's hard to, I think, understand the history before we could be so connected of food, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. So luckily we have historians like the folks in this panel to remind us of that, but there certainly were great things going on. And even when I consult Beard's books, which are not as sort of relevant as they might, as some other books that of the same period might be in certain ways, you see an amazing breadth and depth of cooking of all types, and a knowledge that, I mean, that John can speak to, that Beard had, and certainly that he absorbed and transmitted in a way that is vast and probably those who knew it more profound than any of us have today. So I just want to make sure we set ourselves in the right context. There was tremendous amount of cooking, eating, chopping, what have you going on.
But yeah. Let me just say, John, and because this will, you'll relate to this. When I was looking through the recipes in Beard on Pasta, I was most struck by the Chinese noodle recipes, which came, of course, naturally to him.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that, I think starting, definitely starting in the 1960s, what James Beard brought to American food, or was really prime in bringing to American food, was food as an acceptable lifestyle. That, really before the 1960s, the mid 1960s, food wasn't really a topic that might come up at a dinner party. James Beard made it safe for Americans, especially more affluent Americans, to think about food in a way that they really hadn't before. His cooking classes, which were based in his home, which started in the 1950s and really kicked off in 1959 when he lived on West 10th Street. Those were, almost social events. Husbands and wives would take the classes together. They were quite expensive. And they were things that sort of affluent New Yorkers who lived on the Upper East Side, it would give them a reason to, dip below 14th Street to James Beard's house and, engage in gourmet cooking. And it was something that they could talk about, sort of boast about at dinner parties afterwards, that they had attended cooking classes with the great James Beard. So James Beard really, even, basically long before the 1970s, helped usher in this era when food was a hobby. It was also a lifestyle for a lot of Americans, and it became this kind of aspirational pursuit. Where you shopped, what you cooked, how you threw a dinner party was really part of your social standing in a new way.
So with this program being sponsored by Village Preservation, where you shopped and how you cooked, where did James Beard shop? He was so part of the fabric of the neighborhood, and the New York City is such a rich resource for foods. Who can talk about some of his the places where he shopped?
Well, when I was working with him, he shopped at the Jefferson Market. The other thing he had was endless free food. Endless. People sent him gifts, and he used them. But for shopping, it was right around the corner when the Jefferson Market was on the west side of the street, near the courthouse or near the library. Yeah.
Irene, do you remember the Jefferson Market? Was it like Balducci's? What was it like inside as a market?
No, it was just a really grocery store with a butcher. with a meat counter with a butcher behind the counter. No, nothing like Belgium.
And you could order, I mean, in the old-fashioned way before DoorDash or Amazon Foods, you could order and they deliver, like they answered, they were always on the phone. I mean, they had pictures of Beard shopping there. I didn't see Beard shop there, but I do remember that store very well before it moved across the street. And they were very proud that he had, that it was his local grocery.
Yeah. Oh,
No,
I'm sorry.
please.
Yeah, James was always trying to urge, especially New Yorkers, to shop in a way that people really, a lot of people had stopped shopping that way. I mean, Beard rose to fame in the 1950s when the great achievement in American food was the large gleaming supermarket where you could get lots of produce year round. He was always urging people to shop the old-fashioned way, to cultivate a relationship with an old-fashioned butcher, a fishmonger, not to be afraid to come to Lower Manhattan and shop in Italian bakeries and butcher shops. Really to all of the things that we, a lot of us take for granted about shopping now in the era before farmers markets, which was to cultivate a relationship with the people who are selling you food. They're the people who know best how to cook it, what's in season, what's going to be the best value, at any moment throughout the year, and really to engage with your food in ways that we take for granted, but that was really, there was a steep educational curve in the 1950s and 60s to get most, especially younger Americans, to do that. That sort of tradition had kind of died out and existed only in these sort of, what were called ethnic pockets of the city. So it was really sort of advocating a return to the way that an earlier generation had shopped and interacted with people who sold food.
And in the 60s and 70s, New York City was very clearly demarcated neighborhood-wise, where different neighborhoods had immigrants from different parts of the world clustering. And a really important part of that is establishing food stores with foods of the homeland. And Irene, you and I went many times into these neighborhoods, to the small restaurants and coffee shops where foods of the homeland adapted to New York City were being prepared. And you could also get seasonal produce of types of vegetables and fruits that were favored by the local residents. It had its seasonal rhythm. So Beard was very much in tune with that. And it certainly harkened back to the way that he was raised. John, do you want to talk about his early life in the Pacific Northwest and the seasonality there and being a food spot?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, he was born in 1903 in Portland, Oregon, and was raised there and also on the coast of Oregon, where his mother had a little sort of summer vacation cottage, and she would cater parties on the beach, especially. And so James really sort of grew up in this time and a place where food was really everywhere. What we think of as local food was the only food that was really possible, essentially for most people to purchase. And by 1964, when James writes sort of autobiographical cookbook called Delights and Prejudices, he really kind of celebrates this growing up in this kind of, Eden of food that he sort of portrays Portland and the Oregon coast as being. And this just has a tremendous impact. I mean, in a sense, he's sort of creating a story of American food, that's based on local eating and sourcing. Going out and foraging for all the different sort of types of wild berries that are available in Oregon, going out and catching crawfish in creeks, all the different kinds of varieties of salmon that were available there. It becomes this really appealing kind of lush picture of what's possible in America, if only people would, stay out of the supermarket and look around them for what was available locally. And this also had a tremendous influence on a generation of chefs, people like Alice Waters, who would become, the sort of great chefs, great influential chefs of the 1970s and 80s, and really, start the farm to table movement.
Larry Forgione.
Yes, Larry Forgione for sure. Bradley Ogden. Yes, this whole group of chefs who really revolutionized restaurants.
Expanding the neighborhood a little bit, Beard he had a cooking school on the east side, East 50 something, didn't he? Or what did he do on the east side, I think in the 50s?
Yeah, so with Andre Sermain, who would open the restaurant Lutece out of his home on the Upper East Side. Before Lutece, James Beard and Andre started a cooking school that was run out of the same home. So the roots of the James Beard Cooking School began in 1956 at this sort of fancy, expensive cooking school. Beard did it there for a season or two, and then sort of moved around. And then by 1959, started the James Beard Cooking School, run out of his house, which he did there. And then, of course, most famously at 167 West 12th Street, Beard House.
So previously the cooking school was at the house on West 10th Street, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's where it really got established. James lived there from 1959 to about 1972. And that house, which was just around the corner from the Jefferson Market, kind of across the street from the Jefferson Market courthouse, was really where, James Beard, especially for New Yorkers, got his reputation as, the sort of master cooking teacher, gourmet. That house, he was also across from the old women's house of detention, which was a women's prison that was closed in 1971. But when James Beard moved in 1959, his sort of well-heeled students would come down to the village to take a cooking class. The prison was quite a lively place. He faced the back of it. And he would say that oftentimes, people coming to visit relatives or friends who were incarcerated, they would be yelling up at each other from the street. So he said it was quite colorful. Of course, he loved that. He was really such a kind of maverick that he loved sort of tweaking his well-heeled students, and exposing them to this real taste of the village.
It's hard for people to believe this, but in those days, the Times ran a feature once or maybe twice a year in which they reviewed all of the cooking schools in the city, all the cooking classes in the city, even people who were doing it out of their apartments. It was really a big deal.
Yeah, it was amazing. It's at some point there was, you could take a class from like Diana Kennedy at her apartment in New York City, from like Marcella Hazan, James Beard, all of these great cooks.
I want to say a little bit about the neighborhood, because I think when it was the 15th anniversary of the James Beard Foundation, which is more than 15 years ago, we wanted to do a piece. We assigned an article about what it was about 12th Street, where the house is located, that all these food people live there. I mean, to this day, Mater Joffrey's on one corner, Mimi Sharon's down the street from the Beard House. There were others sort of in that neighborhood. Calvin Trillian, although maybe not known best as a food writer, but certainly among the best. Liddy Marshall, all these folks. And we had a great celebrity journalist, and she interviewed them all. And I thought this is what you were going to say, Irene. It's hard to believe, but the reason they were all there had nothing to do with necessarily the community, but it was cheap to live there. So that what you just described, and food writers made no money. It was bohemian, and now we think of the village as one of the most expensive places is to live in the city. But to the earlier comment that why would there be the Jefferson Market a good place to shop, or even Balducci's in that area? I was like, well, there was demand from both the communities you described, Annie, but also there were a lot of food people around.
Wow, that's historic West 12th Street. That would make an amazing block party.
Yeah. Lady Marshall was on 7th, she was on the Avenue, right? Yeah, right there. I haven't thought of her for years. Yeah.
Well, let's look at 167 West 12th, because it was so fabulous. I remember I worked nearby at an adolescent center, and during my dinner time, I would walk the neighborhood. And I remember passing 167 and just seeing James Beard sitting at his desk right by the window. At that point, he did not look well, very, very overweight. But just there, part of the neighborhood in his home. And wow, what a fabulous house. When it opened for events to the public, Mitchell as the Beard House, going in there and seeing the atrium in the back with the shower that at the time was uncovered, just a glass back, and then a shower on the second floor, open on a landing, and just it was just such a fabulous house. Let's talk about the house. Every things that you know about it that were really outstanding.
It was kind of a strange house to live in. I mean, the spaces didn't open up into one another in any way, and you had to go up that spiral staircase. I mean, I think he moved in, and I guess Guido had an apartment upstairs.
Gino, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, right. And but the back wasn't the way it is now. It was much more closed in. But in the kitchen was right there. It was right. If you walked in, there was an office, yes, and then right behind it was a kitchen, and that's where he cooked, and that's where he did his classes. He stood behind a counter, and the students were on the other side, and he demonstrated. And the thing that impressed me most was that he had a dishwasher that cycled in 10 minutes.
Wow.
That's impressive, even today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, John probably has some more insight into Beard in the house. I'll just say, remind folks that the foundation did not, was created posthumously. So Beard didn't think this was a great place and we should save this. I mean, but many people and friends and many among those who came through that during his life did feel like there was something unique about that space. But I agree with Irene, not just as a place to live, as a place to work. It's a very quirky place. I mean, the idea of a brownstone in the village is quite luxurious in connotation. The reality is they're odd houses, they're narrow, you can't do much with them unless you do a lot with them. And that's always been part of the charm of the Beard Foundation, inviting these great chefs from America and from around the world, when that was one of the focuses of the organization, and focus has changed lately. But when that was the focus during my time, part of its charm, and it had to be charm, was its eccentricities of the space and the kind of idea of the footprints of the people who had been there before.
Mm-hmm.
sure. I have to say, Irene, in sort of reading some things to get ready for this talk, I sort of stumbled on or reacquainted myself with a piece that you wrote in 1983 about the remodeling that was done at 167 West 12th when the atrium was added, which kind of created much more space and a sort of indoor-outdoor area. But your description and sort of interview with James about the about the remodeling was great. That was a really great story.
I don't, after a while, one writes so many of those stories.
Yeah, including that expanding the house gave more space, not only for this chaotic, messy office that James always had, a million things going on, but also his enormous collection of stuff. I mean, he was a lifelong collector of kitchen and other types of antiques. But as you mentioned, his collection of 400 Victorian wine rinsers, now had a home. His Majolica plate collection, his Minton fish plates, all these things that he had collected, he was enormously proud of. And that also, as you suggest with the house, Mitchell, he stipulated in his will should be all auctioned off. So instead of the Beard House being this great shrine to James Beard with his collection of things, it really was an emptied out place. And Irene, you mentioned too last time that you also were reporting on the auction after James Beard died, when basically all that stuff was sold off, and how really kind of sad it was.
It was sad, and the things that had looked exotic and beautiful and special while he was alive and there was life in the house, once he was dead and they were auctioned off, you just saw it was just stuff. Yeah. They no longer had life. Yeah.
Who were some of the customers at that auction? Did you get a sense that there was continuity, that people were buying to continue his legacy?
Oh, not when I was there. There may have been an early day when friends came in or dealers, but I don't think so. It was just curious people.
Yeah, and there were some chefs like Larry Forgione who had really loved and admired James Beard, who bought, was very proud to buy some things, but then sort of reading reports at the time, including yours, it was a lot of, James Beard was so famous that there were just a lot of people who kind of wanted, I think, to come away with a little piece of that fame, and almost didn't matter what they bought. They just wanted something.
Yeah.
And during the 27 years I was at the foundation, occasionally people would send us things that popped up, dolls, stuff that was his, a fountain for the back that had been sold and returned to us. But to John's earlier point, the mission of the organization had never been to sort of preserve a shrine to James Beard. And so we didn't always know, frankly, what to do with all of the stuff we got, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
So Mitchell, the house, when the foundation started there, was pretty stripped down, and the foundation outfitted it for a new mission.
Totally stripped down, empty of everything, bare walls. And yes, so that the foundation was founded in 1987. Beard died in January of 86, I believe.
85.
85, right? Okay. And the first push to do something actually came from Barbara Kafka, who had also been a colleague of his,
Really?
and who offered to write offered to write a cookbook, the Celebration Cookbook, for which she donated her advance to help outfit the foundation, which had, they didn't know what they were going to do. And they invited someone to cook dinner. It happened to be a chef from California. I mean, I'm telling the legend story. The historian John can tell the real story. And Wolfgang Puck cooked a meal and they thought it was great. And Peter Kump, who was then a friend of Beard's and a cooking school founder and who founded our organization, he was a sort of serial entrepreneur, wrote it. We had the letter at least to Wolfgang Puck saying, "Oh, this is great. We should have more of these things." But they didn't have any dishes or glassware. I mean, it was quite an eccentric start, which perhaps Beard might have enjoyed. I don't know.
Well, and really, of course, it was Julia Child who was the great sort of force behind all of these people coming together. I mean, Julia really did want, maybe not a shrine, but she did want a memorial to her great friend James Beard, and she was really influential in kind of rallying support, getting donations, and there's a great letter in the archives at Reed College. So James Beard, infamously was a student at Reed College in 1920, 1921, was thrown out for, being discovered to be having an affair with a male professor. But later in the 1970s, Reed sort of discovered that James Beard had gone there and they really embraced him. And, in a way, really tried to raise money off of James Beard's fame, tried to get donations. And in James's will, he, specified that the townhouse should be sold and the proceeds should go to Reed College. And so when it was reported in the news that Julia Child had said, "This is terrible that this house is just sitting here on the market, we need to buy it and create this memorial to James Beard." Well, there's this sort of furious, panicked letter between people in the alumni office at Reed saying, somebody better get in touch with Julia Child and let her know that Beard promised proceeds of the house to us. Of course, they ended up raising the money and paying, giving the fee to Reed College, so everybody got what they wanted. But yeah, it was really a sort of group effort in the food community of the time to really, create this memorial to James Beard, one that he didn't want, but as you say, Mitchell probably would have been delighted to
I remember Judith Jones grumbling about it and said he didn't want anything. He didn't want anything. Yeah.
But I do think it, I mean, to our earlier conversation, I think it's a sort of symbol of the enthusiasm for food that had risen to the point that perhaps an institution needed to exist. And you see that happen in other places at certain times when all of a sudden people begin to take something a little bit more seriously or aspire to have others take something more seriously. And I do think that the timing of it and the enthusiasm for it is kind of symbolic of what was going on more culturally for food.
Yeah, and James Beard had been, had sort of taught Americans to cook at a time when restaurant chefs were not celebrities, certainly not celebrities. Basically Americans couldn't name probably a single restaurant chef. I mean, they might know a great restaurateur, somebody who would be in the front of the house, but behind those swinging doors, these people were sort of nameless and faceless. And James Beard dying in 1985 really coincided with the moment when American food media especially became really interested and obsessed with chefs as people, chefs as stars and great artists. And I think, the early rise of the James Beard House, the James Beard Foundation, really, had to do partly with this new interest in chefs. And, certainly Wolfgang Puck cooking an early dinner at the Beard House really kind of galvanized support, made it this potentially glamorous place for other chefs to kind of want to contribute to or be part of in some way.
Irene, well, first of all, it was mentioned that the West 12th Street house was an immediate repository of Beard's collections of things and the manuscripts and writings that he had amassed. And he did have a bit of, in reading John's wonderful book, it becomes clear that a good deal of what was published under Beard's name was in fact the hard work of many other people, and who did not always receive attribution. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
And Irene, your part of that contribution of hard work?
Well, yeah, yes. Okay. So I got to work with him because the person who did his writing for him, a woman named Josie Wilson, had been having an ongoing battle about getting some credit. She wanted a byline. And when he absolutely refused, this is what I heard, I don't know what the truth was, she had a nervous breakdown and moved to Portugal. Now, I don't know why Portugal. She probably just, said, I'm out. Anyway, so then because I had done Judith Jones, she introduced me to Jim. And for a long time, all of the thoughts were his. I didn't know anything. I mean, I knew stuff, but I didn't know what he knew. The thoughts were all his, but he, like many busy people, he never could sit down and just write it out. So for a long time, I was writing his columns he worked for American Airlines magazine for a while, and he would dictate, and then Richard, I guess, would transcribe the tapes and give them to me, and then I would make an essay out of them. And then when it came to Beard on Pasta, it was a wonderful experience actually, because I went and he would cook and make things up, and I'd take notes, and I'd take notes of what he said, which would often be part of the head notes. And as I said, we would often have lunch based on what we were cooking that day. And I got very well paid for that, I must say, but my name appeared nowhere in the book, but I had been naive. I mean, you have to negotiate that in advance, and I didn't know that. And there was a book party, and I wasn't invited to the book party, which just crushed my little heart at the time. But it made me grow up and realize if you want credit and a seat at the table, you have to speak up, just as Josie Wilson did. And he had other people writing his books too. At one point, Judith brought me back hoping to get an autobiography out of him, but by then his stories were pretty canned. He had told all those stories too often. I think didn't Judith's husband finally write a collection of those stories? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that turned out to be the first James Beard biography published in 1990, so about 5 years after Beard's death. I think Judith had tried you, and she tried a woman named Mary Goodbody. Yes, she would be sort of sending people down to 167 West 12th to see if they got on. I think Mary told me quite, a similar story, that he was sort of tired and really not that interested in kind of revealing and opening up. I mean, I have to say the most, revealing portrait of James Beard did come from Barbara Kafka in that James Beard Celebration Cookbook. And, Barbara Kafka sort of famously did battle with Judith Jones. And I think they had very different ideas about how to preserve James Beard's legacy and how much personal information about James Beard should really be revealed. You know, Judith Jones was very invested, especially since, you know, at Knopf, you know, she was selling James Beard's books, and they were selling quite well, you know, including Beard on Pasta. You know, and didn't want to trouble the waters by having anything that was too, you know, quote unquote, distasteful about James Beard coming to light. Whereas Barbara Kafka just, you know, was into, you know, wanted to tell an honest story, and also, I'm sure, to tweak Judith Jones.
People probably don't remember Barbara Kafka, who was very well known at the time, and the first person ever to write a microwave cookbook, I guess. Anyway, but she was well known for many, but she was outrageous. And I'm sure I would, if anyone would have been able to get those stories out of Jim, it was Barbara.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. But then you wouldn't be able to trust what she said.
You really trust what anyone says?
So here we have people winning the Beard Award, the Beard Award, and really feeling very, very fortunate. But Mitchell, you were saying that, you know, again, some of them have never heard of or don't know about James Beard. Can you talk about a little bit about that and going into the future?
Sure. Again, I'll say I'm no longer with the organization, and it continues to thrive in wonderful ways. But for the time that I was there, from 93 to 2020, you know, as we've discussed, the sort of celebrity of chefs rose to godly heights, I guess, and it became clear to us. I mean, especially at the 30th anniversary, I realized, you know, the average age of a cook in a kitchen is something like 26 and a half. So they weren't even born when James Beard was alive. And it became really obvious that what became famous about the Beard House was the awards, which is the thing that most people know, but also the people who had cooked there, not that James Beard had ever lived there. And when you think, we were talking about this before, I'm not sure, the legacy of a food person is very short-lived. Even the greatest chefs in New York City, we were just talking about this with some friends the other day. Gray Coons, you know, was a sensation when I got here in the 90s. That, you know, you had to eat at L'Espinasse, and no one was doing anything like he was doing, and not a single person I know remembers who he was. And he recently died, and he was a great chef until he died. But it's a short-lived career. Your next meal is a whole new experience. And so I do think that the Beard Awards and the Beard Foundation are why we're talking about James Beard today, frankly, and I think what we're talking about is way beyond, you know, what Beard was, although all of us were surprised. I was always surprised to go back and see the roots of the things that are so important now, if you're paying attention to food, in those books. You know, whether it's the Chinese noodles Irene was talking about, or the farm to table that John was talking about, it's in there. And he had the benefit of his birth in it, which sort of his trajectory, his life took him from a time in America when food was local, you know, different, let's say. There was an emerging culture, history, tradition from other places, but also from here. And then this industrialization of food, and then finding it again, the roots of finding it again. So his trajectory, the time that he lived, I think, has served us well today as people sort of who want to celebrate American food, and who often want to find a place to hang that celebration on, or an origin story, something that your work, Annie, is very important in. The, you know, where do we come from? What is our identity of food? And Beard and his work almost accidentally fills the bill. And so we can talk about him today because the Beard Foundation exists, but we can also find some really genuine roots for where we are today in the work that he did. What we don't find, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, people listening, people don't cook from Beard's books or recipes much at all. I mean, I cook all the time. I'm always looking at recipes. I can't even remember the last time I made a Beard recipe. And the whole time we were at the Beard Foundation, we were trying in the early days to make meals from recipes that he wrote, but the way we eat changes, the way we shop changes, what we have access to changes. And so the ideas are the thing that persist. And I think it's fascinating, but I also think it's, all the people right now who want to set their legacy in place, should have a reality check, because tomorrow's a new day and another meal.
I think on that note, we'll ask Ariel and Lena to come in with questions from our audience.
Hello. I'm gonna hop in, and Lena is gonna help me organize on the back end. Thank you all so much. I'm so grateful for all of these little windows. We have a few questions, but folks who are here with us, if you do have questions, this is a great time to submit those. One question that I wanted to ask that actually comes from Lena is you talked a lot about the places in the village where James Beard shopped. Where did he play? Is there documentation about that? Or was
That's
he...
John's department.
Yeah, there's some evidence. I mean, the whole point of even in the village, someone with a lot at stake, which James Beard increasingly had in the 1950s as his book sales took off and he got this national profile. The stakes for sort of keeping your public persona were really quite high. So, someone like James Beard who was gay, you had to be quite careful about where you were seen. I think that relaxed a lot for him by the 1970s when, after Stonewall, when other attitudes changed. He met his partner, his 30-year partner, Gino Cofacci, in 1956 at a sort of bar restaurant on West 13th in the village called Felix's Bar. It was this sort of Italian-owned, very discreet place. It's still a restaurant. It's like a little tiny seafood restaurant now. But that was the type of place where, it wasn't, it didn't have this sort of concentrated queer atmosphere that we would expect now. It was more of a mixed place where gay people went to kind of carefully and discreetly socialize and meet each other. So that was one place, certainly. A good friend of James Beard's in the 1950s was always trying to caution James because he thought he was too reckless, that he was a bit too out, and that he wasn't discreet enough. So it was, even though the village was in many ways a safe space, someone with James Beard's persona, public presence still had to be really careful. And so a lot of how he socialized and played was done privately. So especially like brunches, like Sunday brunches in the village, where you could sort of drop in if you were a friend of James Beard, and it was mostly gay men. And it was just extremely relaxed. People could really let their hair down.
That's lovely. Okay, we have Oh, and Lauren has let us know that she makes his ginger pumpkin soup and also his salad dressing with soy and lime. So we've got someone here who's using the recipes, which is great. Um, so
I want to add just a tiny coda to the story about Jefferson Market, which moved from one side of the street to the other and was never the same and blah, 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 blah. But right now there's an amazing Japanese grocery store there that's like walking into Tokyo. It's endless, it's wonderful. And I think it's a beautiful sort of full circle moment that it didn't become a bank or something else. I just want to put it out there. Yeah.
it's a gift when historic sites in the village don't become a bank.
Totally.
We have a question from Patrick, who wants to know, can you speak to James Beard's relationship with Julia Child and their time together at his home? I can just say I was gifted a tour of the James Beard house, and the person who gave me the tour told me that James Beard would sleep with his feet out the window, and when the windows were open, he could hear Julia Child coming from down the street.
That's great. A chef who has since passed away, but he was a student at a culinary school in New Haven, Connecticut, in about 1960, and James Beard came and he brought with him Julia Child. Her book hadn't been, or had just been published, so nobody really knew who she was, and he brought her to come speak to the students with him. And because no one had seen Julia Child on TV yet, no one knew what her voice was like. And so this young student chef said that she stood up in front of the class and began talking, and he said a certain number of the students started laughing, sort of giggling at her voice, which, and James Beard sort of gave a look like, don't be so rude and impertinent. But it's kind of amazing to think of a world where no one yet knows what Julia's voice sounds like. James Beard really helped launch Julia's great collaboration, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, in 1961 when it was published in the US, gave a party, hosted a party in New York City for the food world of New York to meet Julia. It was a very small world at the time, but she felt that really did launch her career in the US, and was always really grateful for James. And then she came and taught in his home at his cooking school when she would be in New York City. So, and of course he went and stayed with her in France many times. So they were good friends. For all of his life.
Thanks. Let's see. We have a question from John. Did Beard know / approve of John Nicholson Belika's food endeavors uptown? Perhaps more of a salon than a foodie thing, but contemporary.
Right, Cafe Nicholson. Yeah, Cafe Nicholson, which is I think where Edna Lewis cooked for a number of years, kind of earlier on in her career, kind of legendary place. Yes, kind of fusing restaurant and cafe in a way that was, I think, pretty novel for its day, with, of course, exquisite cooking from Edna Lewis. I wasn't able to find any connection between Nicholson and James Beard. He must have gone there. He must have eaten there, but I couldn't find it documented anywhere.
Thanks. Lisa wants to know, shouldn't there be another documentary or film about James Beard? Are there things in the works?
It's funny you should ask. My biography got optioned, and so a couple of great writers, David Talbot and Andrew Sean Greer, are adapting it for a series. So yeah, so we're talking about that right now.
Oh, and the dog is excited too.
She is, yeah, she's quite excited. She's like piping up.
That's very exciting to hear. We have, yes, congrats. A question from Leanna about Beard's cooking classes in his home. Were they, let's see. She says, I'm just gonna read this. Anna Pump, a featured cook in my Hamptons and Long Island homegrown cookbook, told me that they sat on stools around the kitchen and she learned more of her English there at class. She drive in from Garden State. What can you share about those classes?
Well, yes, yeah. I'm not sure when she would have attended the classes, but yeah, they sort of changed over the years as James got a bit older and maybe a bit more infirm, but they always had the same sort of form. They would last a couple of weeks, and they were, you know, different levels, and they were pretty small, and they were kind of social events as well. So all the students would cook together, watch James make something, make it themselves. And then a big part of the classes was that afterwards you would sit around and eat the food that you had cooked. James Beard had a sort of a tall director's stool, and he would sit there, and as he got a bit older, he couldn't really walk around so easily and interact with the students. So he always had assistants, but he would sort of sit in his director's chair and make comments, you know, at the students for their efforts. But everyone, you know, a lot of people always talk about what great kind of bonding experiences those classes were, you know, that they met a lot of like-minded people, made friendships, you know, some of which lasted over the years. You know, it was more than just like a, you know, a cooking demo that you'd see on YouTube. It was really kind of immersive.
And John, in your book, you talk about Beard's early life and aiming for the theater. So
Right.
many of his cooking classes were very theatrical. And you talk about, what was the copper bowl and whisking the meringue? Or was it meringue? Can you tell us?
Right, for the souffle, yes. So teaching a souffle was you know, one of his great sort of lessons in the class. And you know, in the 1950s and 1960s, you know, at kind of affluent dinner parties, hosts and hostesses really wanted to impress their guests with a souffle, but it was a very intimidating kind of dish. And so James Beard was trying to make it seem very easy, which it is. But yes, his great moment was kind of whisking the egg whites to the proper stage, at which point they would not tip out of the bowl. So he would then hold his sort of copper bowl above his head, you know, while presumably students sort of gasped, would say, you know, this is the correct way. So yes, definitely using his hamminess, his theatrical roots. And, you know, this was a great part of demystifying cooking, making students feel comfortable, you know, that this was not drudgery to cook for your family, that this was fun, that this could be a great hobby.
Those days, if you went to a fancy French restaurant, you would be asked when you ordered, or even before you ordered, if you want a souffle for dessert, you know, order it now.
Right, yeah, right.
And the advice is to always say yes to that.
I think that's great advice. I'm curious, John, as you were talking about the cooking classes and just the spirit of bonding and all of these things, I was thinking about the dinners at the James Beard House, that the house runs them, the foundation runs them. Not, you'll have to clarify, Mitchell. But I'm thinking about that same sort of spirit of learning and bringing in guest chefs and just this kind of bonding legacy. Can you speak to that a little?
Sure, and that in fact is where the idea came from in some ways. This that the Beard's House was a meeting place, and those and sort of socializing and relationships were formed there. And the dinners, they really became a showcase for what was happening across the country in America in food at that time, as John explained, when attention was first coming to the people who were doing the cooking, not just the people who were hosting or owning or what have you. And I do think certainly bonds were formed at the Beard House, and the James Beard Foundation is the organization. The Beard House is the place. Is its home. I'm often confounded. That's to clarify that. I mean, and I'll be honest. I'm speaking personally right now. One of the challenges of that scenario is that it is an exclusive club, even though the foundation isn't public nonprofit and everything's always been open to everybody. You did have to afford to be able to attend, and in the current, and it's also a time, I think we don't think about this, like you signed up, you paid in advance, it was a set menu, and that wasn't very common in restaurants. It requires a bit of trust of the eater to just say, oh, I'll eat whatever they bring me, if it's not a wedding, for instance. And not only is it not a wedding, and it's not just going to be a chicken crepe, it's going to be some chef's creative food, and I'm gonna have to eat it. And that's a kind of requires a level of sophistication of a dining public to just let themselves go. That might have been new at the time. Now people go to pop-ups, people sit at tasting menus, very common. Tasting menu wasn't so common then, I don't think, here. So that evolved, that sort of sat you down at a table with a young PR person, an older couple who loved food and traveled to Europe a lot, and everything in between, as New York does. And that's always been part of the charm of this little dining room on the second floor of that house on 12th Street that glowed. I'm not sure what the plan is for the future. Obviously, with the pandemic, they've closed and the dinner stopped. And there are some of us who hope that the reimagining, the reopening, is a more accessible experience, given now how broadly interested people are in food, and the kind of frankly the revelations of the voices that haven't been included in some of the stories, to find a way to get everyone to really have a seat at that table. Although the intent was always to be that, the realities sometimes were different. Try to give a roundabout diplomatic answer, even though I have no association anymore. But part of my dream was that we'd find a way to really invite anybody who was interested in coming, to be able to come and make that possible.
Yeah.
I appreciate that very much. I'm gonna just ask one more quick question from William, who is from Portland, who says, could you say a little bit about Beard's annual summer teaching in Seaside, Oregon?
Yeah, so yes, so starting in 1973, James Beard taught an annual summer cooking class in Seaside, Oregon, which is a small town on the coast south of Astoria. And I actually got to visit the high school. So James Beard taught the classes in basically what was the home ec classroom of this school. And so I got to visit the kitchen, the home ec classroom. They don't teach home ec classes there anymore. But these were sort of events that were, people who attended them looked forward to every year. Those were real kind of social opportunities, because there would be local people, but also people flying in, and it tended to be the same students year after year. He did it for not quite 10 years, maybe 7 or 8 years. And, it was in the place that he loved most on the planet, the Oregon coast. So, at a time when he was older and a bit more infirm, it was a place where he could be really relaxed. And he would have assistants come to help. His sort of great mentee and friend, Marion Cunningham, the cookbook author, would be one of his assistants every year. And these were great sort of social bonding events. I guess people, learned how to make dishes, but they were really opportunities for people to get together, to drink outside the class, go out and eat together. So, other cooking teachers at the time were cooking and, teaching in more glamorous places.
Oh,
Whoops, he just froze.
yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll get you back soon, John. Well, I feel like we could talk about all of this all night. Mitchell, you look like you were about to say something.
I was going to say, one of the I have very few regrets of my time at the Beard Foundation, which was a wonderful time for so many reasons. But not that long ago, that his family house in Gearhart, Oregon, on the coast, was put up for sale, and we were notified, but the foundation wasn't really in any position to purchase it at the time. And again, our mission was not to sort of preserve the shrine of James Beard. But I felt like that, if that would have been something to do. I'll just say, I feel like we've always tried to maintain the connection that Beard had to Portland and to Oregon in general. It was so unique to him, and Oregon happens to be such an amazing food town today as it was in his time. And so it's a very close relationship, and we've talked for many years about having a foothold there. And in fact, there's a public market project that's been going on now for 20 years. I don't know that it will ever materialize, but a lot of passionate people are trying to make the James Beard Market a reality there too, because of his relationship to that place. So it was just to reiterate what John was saying, a very special place for him always.
Wow. So it seems like there are many legacies that will continue, and I just want to know who's going to play James Beard in the movie. I really want to know. He's such an amazing physical presence. Well, thank you all so much. I'm hoping that we'll get John back, but we might have to say farewell without him. I'm so grateful to all of you. Yeah, Oliver Platt, Francie says, that's great. That's a great idea. Thank you all so very much for being here and for showing us such a complex picture of someone who just sounds, very, very full of myth and truth, all at the same time here in our neighborhoods. So
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone who's here with us. We're gonna just keep an eye out. We're sending out a little follow-up email with some links and just a brief survey, and of course a link to donate. So thank you all so much for your support and your participation, and take good care.
Thanks for bringing us together, and thanks for the work that you do preserving the village, which is such a unique place. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Stay.
Take care. Have a good night, everyone.